Did the author of Matthew use Luke as a source for their gospel? This is Matthean Posteriority. Did Matthew use Mark and Luke? The Farrer hypothesis says something different. And for those who are interested in understanding what is the synoptic problem, what is the problem? What are the issues? We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. And today we're going to be talking about, the synoptic problem. When Gospels were written before, which ones, who's using what, and there are various hypotheses. Today, we're going to be dealing with Matthean Posteriority, but we're going to talk about what that means, what that is, what's the problem. And with that, our guest is Dr. Alan Garrow. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
That's right, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your expertise, background, and such?
Okay, so my name's Alan Garrow, and I'm a member of the Sheffield Interdisciplinary Institute for Biblical Studies, or Institute for Tongue Twisters, and I'm also the vicar of St. Peter's Church in Harrogate. So I'm a full-time pastor in a church in the north of England. I did my PhD at Oxford University, and I worked on Matthew's relationship with a little text called the Didache. And it was from there that I found myself coming in round the back and the side of the synoptic problem, and seeing things from a different angle made me think, oh, it's obvious, Matthew must be using Luke. And I published a couple of articles about that in the journal New Testament Studies in 2016. And around that time, so there's a guy also called Rob McEwen who published a book on the same subject the year before. And since then, this question, could Matthew have used Luke, has become a hot topic in this particular area, and there's been a lot of debate and discussion about it. Previously, it wasn't really making any waves at all.
Wow. So this is what we call the Wilk hypothesis.
Well, it's actually, we don't call it the Wilke hypothesis so much anymore. Wilke was a German pastor who, more than 100 years ago, said, you know what? Matthew used Luke. Trust me, he really did. But he didn't have enough traction to overcome the way things were going at that time. He wasn't. He didn't have an influential university position, for example. He didn't write a great deal about the idea of Matthew using Luke. He just said, I'm really sure this is the case. A few other people through the course of the modern era have said the same thing, but they've never been in a position where people took any notice of them. So it's one of the amazing things that, a lot of them have been students writing their first article maybe, or coming from a different field, and people just haven't reacted to it. And if you're not part of the conversation, then it's easy to get ignored, and that's how it's been for quite a long time, until I'd say about 2015 things started to rise up from this particular hypothesis.
And most people who are watching this who don't know about this are lost. So don't worry, we're going to get you on track. We're going to explain why this is an issue and why we're talking about this today. Before we do, I want to give an introduction to your book. Number one, The Gospel of Matthew's Dependence on the Didache, and this is on Amazon. If you like this episode and you're interested in hearing more about what Dr. Garrow has to say, this is a book probably worth checking out. Can you tell us briefly what this book is about?
It's, there's a lot of similarities between, there was a little text called the Didache that was discovered in 1873. It nearly got into the New Testament, but didn't. And it has a lot of parallels with Matthew's Gospel, and it also mentions Matthew's Gospel. And so when it was first discovered, there was kind of an assumption that it must know and use Matthew's Gospel. In the middle of the 20th century, scholars started to say, actually, there are some real problems with that. It doesn't look like the Didache does know Matthew for considerable chunks of it. And so my book is really flipping the question all the way around and saying, wouldn't it make more sense if Matthew is using the Didache? And I try to make the case that's true. And if it is true, then that also has an impact on the synoptic problem, because Matthew, you've got another bit of data to throw into the mix there, and it sorts things out as far as I can see. That's how I got into it anyway.
Yeah, I think we're going to dive in as time goes by to find out why this whole question is important to you. And each person seems to say they have a piece of the pie, and it somehow influences their conclusions on this synoptic problem. But we're going to get to that. The problem page, I just pulled this up when I was looking up the synoptic problem on your blog. I want everybody to know they can go and they subscribe to your blog where you write on stuff all the time. This is particularly on the synoptic problem here. Also, you can help support us here at MythVision's Patreon, working very hard. We have a community of people who are like-minded, who talk about all this stuff and more. So please consider helping support us. And that's in the description. The first question I think that's worth asking you, Dr. Garrow, is synoptic problem. We got a problem? Well, what is the problem? What do you mean?
So it's a puzzle, really. So you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They've got really substantial similarities between them. Somebody is copying somebody else. So who copied whom is really the question. And it should be a pretty simple puzzle to solve. You've only got three entities. And provided you can work out which one is first, then you're then down to two basic options. So it's one of those. It's become a celebrated puzzle in New Testament studies. People have been worrying about it for nearly 200 years. But my own position is that it's been made much more complicated than it should do. It's really quite simple. Okay.
I was going to say, just to show people visually what we're dealing with, and I only grabbed 4. There are more, because if you take the combination of 3 and you just move it in different ways, you're going to have different hypotheses about how this started. Right now, we've interviewed Mark Goodacre here on the Farrer hypothesis that Mark is the first gospel, and then Matthew, of course, is the next, and then Luke knows Matthew, according to the Farrer hypothesis, and Mark, of course. So Mark's used in both gospels. There's also the two-source hypothesis, where Mark influences both Matthew and Luke, but Matthew and Luke are independent of each other, and that Luke is aware of not only Mark, but also Q, and Matthew knows Q and Mark. So there's different versions of this, by the way, that I've seen, where I've actually seen Q have an arrow over to Mark as well. And I don't know if that changes the whole game, Dr. Garrow.
Yeah, it's that's not such a common theory, but a lot of things are possible. Actually, one of the things which I'd say is more remarkable about the synoptic problem is that, given that there are really quite a lot of theoretical solutions, very few of them have been investigated in any depth. And so there's kind of an assumption that, well, we've been worrying about this for nearly 200 years. Surely all the options have been exhausted. And really, it's only 3 or 4 that have been investigated very thoroughly. And so there's definitely room for moving on to a new solution now.
Wow. Okay. And then there's also Matthew was written first, which I think a lot of church tradition tries to, say that Matthew, or there's a form of Matthew that's first. Luke knows Matthew and Mark knows both. It seems that position is probably not the most popular, I would suspect.
Yeah. So I would say that 99% of scholars think that Mark is used by Matthew and Luke. There was a book that came out very recently arguing for Griesbach, but apart from that, I don't know of any active scholars who support this view. It's actually, I could be wrong about that. I'm not totally across what everybody's doing around the world, of course. But it's really remarkable how support for the Griesbach hypothesis has collapsed in the last 20 years. It was the main contender to the main challenger to the two-document hypothesis not that long ago. But now you'd really have to work very hard to find somebody to write a chapter in support of it if you were putting together an edited volume or something.
It seems the two-document hypothesis, from what I understand, is like the number one contender I hear.
Yeah, I think definitely in Germany it's way ahead. Mark Goodacre has done an astonishing job of chipping away at that lead over the last 20 years. And I'd say that amongst younger scholars in the UK and North America, certain parts of North America, his theory is increasingly popular. And you look at online surveys, which are not terribly reliable, but some put 2DH in the two document hypothesis in the lead, some put Farah in the lead. They have become the two main parties in the last 10, 20 years, I'd say.
Thank you. And then the one I got here is the hypothesis that you'll be proposing, which I just found this the name particularly on Wikipedia, but it's that Mark is the earliest, just like the Farah. Luke knows Mark, and Matthew knows Mark as well, but that Matthew uses Luke and not the Farah, which is the idea that vice versa. So does this hypothesis include Q? Whereas like it seems that Goodacre's not a big proponent of Q, not saying it's not there, but does your particular hypothesis, you can have it or not have it, it doesn't matter, or how does it work with your hypothesis?
Yeah, so to say that Mark Goodacre is not a particular proponent of Q is a bit of an understatement. He's made a career out of trying to eliminate Q. But my view of it, the situation, I think a really important mistake was made early on by scholars who believed in Q, because they found a bit of evidence which suggested that there was a source shared by Matthew and Luke. And I think that evidence is there, actually. I don't think it's very extensive, but it's not terribly unlikely that there would be sources floating around in an early period which those gospel writers might, both of them, have thought was useful for including in their text. But they made a logical mistake, which was to say, if Matthew and Luke both use a common source, that means that Matthew cannot use Luke and Luke cannot use Matthew. Now, if you stop to think about it, that's obviously nonsense. I mean, just because you might have seen a podcast and thought, oh, that's good stuff, I could use some of that material on my blog, and another person has seen the same thing and copied it onto their blog, doesn't mean to say that person A can't also copy the other guy across the way. It's it doesn't put a Berlin Wall between them. Mm-hmm. And so personally, I think that there is scope for, because I think the Didache is a source used by both Luke and Matthew, but it's a small consideration. The much more important question to answer, if you're sure that Mark is first, the next question to answer is what's the relationship between Matthew and Luke? And really, you've got two options: either Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew. Now, if neither of those options is possible, and there's some really good reason why neither of them works, then you get into the classic cube hypothesis and say, well, the only way of explaining the material that Matthew and Luke share that isn't in Mark, it's quite extensive. It's about 4,000 words. Some of it is word for word the same. The only way of explaining that is by interposing their common use of Q. But that's a very serious step to take. You should only take that step when you're really sure that Luke could not have used Matthew and Matthew could not have used Luke. But what happened historically, you referenced this earlier on, is there was a kind of assumption that Matthew was first. It was the record of the apostle, and so 100 years ago there was a kind of an assumption that Matthew could not have used Luke. And assumptions are really powerful, aren't they? Once you got it in your head that you don't need to consider that part of the problem, that you just focus on another part. And so those scholars focused on arguments why Luke couldn't have used Matthew. And I think...
So, Dr. Garrow, we lost you for a second there. I almost thought you were raptured, but then again, I thought maybe that's heresy. I'm not sure where it went. But you were pointing out the conversation is not really happening, or wasn't happening, on Mark using Luke. That wasn't really an option. And then it became something that really gained a little traction in the last, 20, 30 years or so?
Yeah, so it's just funny how the conversation goes. Scholars tend to talk about what scholars are talking about, and the way the conversation had gone in the past was the assumption that Matthew can't have used Luke, so we're not going to look at that question. And then so the question that really got looked at is whether Luke could have used Matthew. And there were those who thought this is not possible. And so the only way of explaining the material shared by Matthew and Luke that isn't in Mark, there's quite a lot of it, some of it's very close indeed, is to say, well, they must have been using a shared source. Now, the conversation since then has gone on with people saying, no, Luke could have used Matthew. And the Q scholars saying, no, I really don't think that's the case. Still not engaging with the possibility that Matthew used Luke. And actually, I think the internet has really got a lot to do with changing the pace of that conversation, because lots of people have been saying Matthew used Luke over the years, but they've not been able to talk to each other. And now they've been collecting together and saying, you know what, actually, this is a real thing. And some important publications have come out which have raised it above the parapet. And now the challenge really for the two document people, the Q hypothesis people, and for Farage to say, well, give us a reason why Matthew could not have used Luke. Because we've got lots of reasons. Mark Goodacre and others have done a fantastic job of saying Q is really unlikely in the form that it's commonly postulated. And we've got a lot of good people like John Kloppenborg and others saying, well, it's really unlikely that Luke used Matthew. So the next question is, why didn't Matthew use Luke? And so far, amazingly little has been published on that. Mark Goodacre published a chapter in a book earlier this year. There was a little article in 2017 by a guy called Joel Downing. And there's another, Alex Andreas has published a little bit. I've actually got something coming out in a journal later this year which responds to all of those. And they're really little arguments. They're not saying, when you look at this, standing back and say, well, it just doesn't make sense the way that Matthew uses Luke according to your theory. Actually, everything that Matthew does in his treatment of Luke is in keeping with his treatment of Mark. And everything he does in his treatment of Mark and of Luke is in keeping with how other authors in that period merged together common sources, related sources, which they were putting together into one narrative. So there's really, from my point of view, there is no problem. I mean, not to say there are no problems, but it just is really simple and straightforward to say Matthew used Luke. And I think that the ball is pretty much in the court of those other scholars now to say, well, give us a good reason why that couldn't be the case, because we've had so much traffic on why Luke can use Matthew and why Q is unlikely.
Okay. This is interesting. So there's an absolute agreement on Mark being the first gospel.
Not absolute, but pretty close. Yeah.
Okay. And is there any really good reason to think that Mark wasn't the first gospel other than Papias' mention?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there are some little places where you get Matthew saying early in the morning and Luke saying first light, and Mark having both of those together. And that might look like Mark is conflating Matthew and Luke, and that would be a really good argument for saying that Mark is last rather than first. But they're very small examples. And actually, there are much bigger examples of Matthew conflating related material in Mark and Luke. So I think it makes much more sense to have Matthew third there. But yeah, it's possible to read these things always round. But the reason why Mark is so commonly seen as first now is because of what happens when you compare Matthew and Luke's use of Mark with the way that other authors were using similar sources in similar situations. It just fits that wider pattern. So a big trend in the last 20 odd years is to look at ancient compositional practices. What was everybody else doing when they were doing this kind of work? And how does that fit or not fit with the way that our authors, the gospel writers are behaving under a given hypothesis?
There's a lot here to really discuss and try to get into. I'm kind of thinking to myself, what were some of the strong points that you would say actually convince you mostly that Matthew is third, meaning using Luke as well?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it's really, it's a very simple process. You start off by saying, well, I think there are really good reasons for saying that Matthew and Luke both used Mark. So then you're down to your next question. Either Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew. Which is it? And it seems to me really unlikely that Luke used Matthew, because we can tell quite a lot about Luke by the way he uses Mark. Luke uses Mark generally in blocks. So there's a big chunk of Mark, and then there's some other stuff, and there's a big chunk of Mark, and there's some other stuff, and a big chunk of Mark. And generally speaking, he keeps Mark and material in the same order that we find in Mark. So it looks like it's a pretty simple cut and paste job. In that process, he adapts Mark a little bit. And that's not to say there are no universals in this, but that's the general pattern. When Luke uses Matthew, if Luke uses Matthew, the way he treats Matthew is completely different. He doesn't have Matthew in blocks at all. Actually, he breaks up Matthew's discourses and spreads them across his gospel. Now, looked at the other way, Matthew, his treatment of Mark is really typical. Because what these ancient authors did was they say, well, I've got 3 versions telling the same story. I'm going to read them all, decide which one I think is most accurate and complete, use that as my frame, and then I'll read the others. I'll take information from the others, which is supplementary. It fills things out a little bit, and I'll slot that in at the places governed by the frame provided by my main source. That's what Matthew does with Mark. Matthew is effectively fat Mark. It's Mark with lots more teaching of Jesus put into that framework. And if Luke is one of Matthew's sources, then the way he treats them is exactly how other authors doing the same kind of thing also treated their sources. So the Sermon on the Mount is a great example, actually, where actually there Matthew takes Luke's Sermon on the Plain as his frame, and then he fills that out with other material from elsewhere in Luke and from Mark, and I'd say from the Didache, to create everything that you want to know about what Jesus has to say about the law. Nice set-piece discourse. He's followed ancient compositional practices producing that. If Luke uses Matthew, then he reverses that process. So the effect is, it's like if you were to reverse the movie of Luke using Matthew, what you would get is someone acting like a really conventional author. But as it is with Luke using Matthew, he's behaving like somebody like we never see in the 1st and 2nd century. More like a 20th century movie maker with lots of cuts and splicing things across all of that. It's really complicated work. It's very difficult to do. Another thing which is a real problem for the Pharaohs is a thing called unpicking, as it commonly talked about. This is where you've got 2 versions of the same story. If Matthew's using Luke and Mark, he's spliced them together. But if Luke is using Matthew, he has to go in and pull out all the bits that Mark has added, or that Matthew has added to Mark. That's right. Has to pull out all the bits that Matthew's added to Mark and leave behind the Mark and stuff. That's a really amazing operation. Now, if you had Mark Goodacre on here, he would dispute that. But this is a pattern which I think happens an awful lot. And it's one of the things which convinces most people that Luke couldn't have used Matthew. And if you were to ask a Farah supporter, what do you think is the weakest point in the Farah hypothesis, they might well say, well, unpicking does require, it requires some special pleading, some special arguments as to why that actually kind of constantly worked out. Actually, what happened was that Luke was just using Matthew, wasn't thinking about Mark at all, because he's using Matthew in blocks, because that's what Luke does. And it just so happened that the way that he used Matthew left out the Markan bits.
I'm sorry. What is the weakest argument you'd say for your hypothesis?
Yeah. So most things about Matthew using Luke, I think, fit really easily, and somebody just observing that without any background, so I can see how that works. The question that is requires a more complicated answer, and so is a weaker spot, is to say, well, if Matthew uses Luke, how come he hasn't got all that good stuff like the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son, or there's material in the birth narrative that Matthew completely ignores, there's resurrection appearances that Matthew doesn't use. So then someone in my position has to say, well, there is a logic to that. You can say Matthew has a consistent pattern in the sorts of things he omits, but that's a more complicated answer. So if I was wanting to attack my own hypothesis, what I would do is to say, there's something that you'd really expect Matthew to pick up from Luke, and he doesn't. Why is that?
Right. And of course, I think that just for a second, I think it's good to talk about Matthew if we can, and then just to get your thoughts. I've mentioned this in the last discussion I did with Mark Goodacre on this Q issue, or not Q, but the FAR hypothesis. And we talked about Q and we talked about this. But in Matthew, it's the only gospel that has what sounds to me very Jewish tendencies in some respects. And I mean that like, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We don't find that in any other text. The idea that, to the 12 disciples, there is this in Luke, but it's like he's clearly telling them to the 12, you 12 will be seated on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Very, I don't know, I guess I'd call it Jewish, but it seemed it's very exclusive until, of course, the go out into the nations, of course, and preach the gospel at the end. So what do you see in Matthew that's really unique? What's he up to? Because I know that taking this magnifying glass and like trying to parse out who was what, you're forced to know the character, to know the narrative, to know the story, to kind of get familiar with this person through their writing, whoever they are. And it's, getting you to start seeing a trend of the kind of style they are. What do you see in him that's unique?
Well, I think that Matthew is very keen on demonstrating that Jesus is the Messiah. So he wants to take every opportunity to show how Jesus' life and ministry fulfills Old Testament prophecy. But another thing that he's really keen on is gathering together what Jesus had to say on various subjects like the law, that's the Sermon on the Mount, mission, the end times. So he creates these blocks of material, and he wants to preserve, I think he's somebody who wants to preserve everything that Jesus has to say on the subjects he's interested in. And so he's got an old source and he thinks it's reliable, he'll try and include it. So I was sent only to the lost sheep of house of Israel might well be something that Matthew has picked up as, this is something which I think Jesus really said. I'm interested in what Jesus said, and I want to preserve it for posterity. I want future generations of Christians to be able to read this and learn it and use it. And so he stuffs it in. And that's why you get some things which are very old and Jewish, and other things which are more open and Gentile focused, all in the same bag. Now, I think that Matthew is also reacting against Luke's openness to a law-free gospel. So he wants to say, actually, I don't think that's really the story. We want the law is important still. And so there's a bit of a editing out of that kind of emphasis in Luke. Another interesting edit that Matthew gets into is he edits out female autonomy. So Luke has lots of women who behave in untraditional manners, and Matthew tends to chop them out of his narrative. So maybe he's got a male audience, maybe he's got a richer audience, a more establishment audience. So Luke is much more radical about money than Matthew is, and you find Matthew kind of toning down the dial on that, so that people aren't condemned just for being rich. It's possible to be rich and be a follower of Jesus. And actually, I think that in terms of the success of Christianity, Matthew's gospel is really important for making it acceptable to the middle classes, if you like. Because if you only had Luke's gospel, you'd think, well, this guy he's pretty extreme. He's saying, give out all your possessions. He's saying, give to poor people without asking for it back. Goes on about money a tremendous amount. And he also has some quite weird parables in there, like the unjust steward who gives away, writes off debts before being kicked out of his job. And so we would have quite a different picture, and one which I think most Western Christians would probably find a bit more challenging, actually.
As far as Acts goes, I was recently talking to Dominic Crossan, and he was saying that he thinks that Luke wrote Acts as like a sequel to the same, like it's a 2-volume work to him. Yeah. Do you see Acts appear in Matthew at all?
No, I don't. I think that's right. That it is a 2-volume work. There's a guy called Bartosz Adamczewski who thinks that Matthew uses Acts as well. That's not something I've looked into, and I think that there's not a tremendous amount of scope for it, because what Matthew is interested in doing is weaving together teaching of Jesus, and you don't get that in Acts. So that's not a job he's set out to do.
Okay, I got to look into that other scholar. There's so much interesting stuff here. I've been torn on this Gospel of Matthew, because while it's extremely Jewish in one sense, if you get what I'm putting down here, it's also foreshadowing what I've heard other academics call, and it may not be the best term, replacement theology. So it's like it kind of makes me wonder if there's multiple edits to this. Or does it look like it's the same author who's giving you both material and saying God's going to take the vineyard away from the Jews, which it's simultaneously extremely Jewish, but there's a Jewish mission throughout the whole thing. And so much so, Jesus is like, to like the Syrophoenician woman, yes, I'm granting you this, but I'm on a mission for the Jews right now. Okay, Mr. Centurion, you have greater faith than everyone in Israel. That's awesome. I'm on a mission for the Jews right now. But he still like gives them the nod. He gives them the blessing, and then knows, hey, don't worry. In the end, the mission's going out. There's even what seems to me, I read Allison's commentary on this, and I thought, okay, this is interesting. Might be a fossil where he's talking about you will not have gone through all the houses in Israel before the Son of Man comes. That kind of an apocalyptic fossil here that maybe from the lips of Jesus. I just have a hard time wrestling with this. Am I on the right scope, do you think, on understanding mission? But the author's already aware of the Gentile mission while authoring this?
Yeah, I think that seems likely that the Gentile mission is out there, and I think that it's kind of accepting its reality, but also a bit cautious about its effect on the core tradition. So it feels like wanting to pull things a little back more towards Jerusalem, if you like, rather than away into the Gentile territories that Luke and Paul have been going into. So it's a attempt to rebalance, but it's definitely not the Gentile mission is not part of this at all. We're retrenching absolutely to being a hardcore Jewish outfit. It's just trying to get back to those roots a little bit. But as I say, it's got a lot to do with the raw material. I don't think Matthew generates anything himself, would be my guess. I'm saying I think he's knitting together the sources he has available, and that limits his material. Some will be pro-Gentile, some will be less so.
What do you do with the idea of Matthew 7? I have speculated, I'm sure other scholars have, that this might be jabbing at Pauline Christianity here. The idea that you don't need to observe Torah, like you're talking about, the law is not significant. And there'll be people who I did this in your name, I did this in your name, which might be just generally any Christian, but it sounds like people following that drift, especially towards Gentiles, maybe, that like you don't need the law at all. Antinomianism might be setting in at this point. Do you think Matthew's kind of jabbing at Paul, or do you think Matthew might be jabbing at what became of Pauline Christianity?
Oh, this is a really complicated area, Derek, because you have to be careful about 16th century interpretations of Paul. So I think that Matthew is definitely wanting people to be properly righteous according to the way that Jesus kept the law, and I think that he's anxious, he's nervous about appalling Christianity reflected in Luke's gospel, which is saying that Jesus just comes and forgives people, and the thief on the cross, he's just forgiven. The prodigal son, he's just forgiven. Matthew leaves those out, and that might suggest that he's keen on people being properly righteous. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence that indicates actually, it's mostly ethics. It's saying if you want to be a follower of Jesus, you need to do these things and not do these things. So I'm confident that, yes, I think there is a dialogue between these two different streams of Christianity. At the same time, it's trying to hold stuff together, because it really isn't the case, according to my theory, that Matthew's rejecting Luke altogether. He's accepting that Luke's got good material that's worth including, some of it word for word, but the tone and the tenor is drawing back on some of the aspects that Matthew might think is extreme in Luke.
What do you do with the prologue in Luke, where it sounds like Luke is saying many other accounts have been written? And so when we talk about many, I would imagine more than just Mark might be what he means. And everything else beyond that is kind of speculative. If we don't have John, if we don't have Matthew yet, all we have is Mark. And when he says many, I kind of wonder what you do with the prologue. Was that added later, or was the prologue there at the outset of Luke's gospel, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a respectable view to think that the first 3 chapters were added later. It's not a view that I hold at the moment myself. But I think about stories about Jesus, the way things go with this sort of thing is that immediately after the event, so say the eruption of Vesuvius, everybody who was anywhere near that would be talking about it immediately afterwards. There'll be loads of different versions. And across the empire, anyone who was within 100 miles of that thing would have, I saw this, and did you see that? And some people might write it down, and gradually it comes down to Pliny's account, which gets preserved for us. So we've just got one. So as time goes by, actually, you don't get a proliferation of those first-hand accounts. They tend to narrow down. Now, you might get more fantastical versions growing up later on, and the same with stories about Jesus. There's all kinds of fanciful Gospels which have got no connection to the canonical Gospels, or very little at least. So I think that Luke can be writing really early and saying, lots of people have got lots of stuff to say about Jesus. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to condense that into something which is sensible and that you can trust, Theophilus. If he's writing later, then actually I think that there's less chance of having the sort of raw materials he'd be interested in trying to produce a historical account. It's one of those things that cuts both ways, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this would be a jab at Purvo. So Richard Purvo's work and stuff, and I think Steve Mason has written something where he was talking about how Luke Acts looks like it knows of the 93 publication of Josephus. And I know it's a complicated argumentation, but I've thought about that, and it was really interesting because he was showing stuff that shows up that has really no relevance to the story that we have in Acts, but does play significant role in Josephus's work, and showing where those places are where it's lifted. I don't know if you've read his argument on that or not, but I didn't know if you had a thought on it, or. Yeah,
I mean, it's a respectable and respected argument. I'm working on something which I hope is going to counteract it and say, actually, we can demonstrate that Luke knows things about the history of the early church that he couldn't have known by any means other than having some kind of a direct connection to it. So this is still all in play. It's an important question. If Luke does know Josephus, then that puts him later. It doesn't mean to say that he's necessarily using Matthew. It doesn't mean that Matthew, if Matthew's using Luke, goes even later than Luke.
Right.
It's also possible that Luke is present when Josephus is rehearsing his narrative in Rome. You know, there's all kinds of possibilities. But yeah, it is an important argument. It definitely needs to be dealt with. But the difficulty with all those things, just remember how difficult it has been to decide whether Matthew used Luke or Luke used Matthew or they both used the. And we've got loads of material there. And with Josephus, you've got just a few fragments here and there.
There's so much. Oh, this debate. I wonder if it'll ever be settled. I can't imagine.
It will. I promise you, it will. I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I'd say if we were to reconvene in 20 years, we'll be in a very different place from where we are now. Just because you're not going to make progress with the problem if you don't consider all the answers. So the basic approach to problem solving of any kind is consider all the options. Mm-hmm. And choose the one which is the most satisfying. We haven't been doing that. So if you've just been arguing between the two options that don't fit, and everyone, even the proponents of those two views mostly admit that there are problems with them, then yeah, if you only had those two people loggerheads, you're never going to make progress. It's never going to be solved. Of course not. But it's a simple problem. There are only 3 entities in it. We're pretty confident that Mark is first. How hard can it be? Now, That's not to say that there isn't scope for more complications, different versions of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, different sources shared by them and so on. But in the basic question of who copied whom, and to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is not complicated. We jolly well ought to be able to solve it. And actually, it's pretty embarrassing that we haven't until now. Some pretty smart people have been working on this for a long time, but you can't get the answer if you don't look at, you can't solve a problem if you don't look at the solution that actually works.
Couple more questions. The Gospel of John, are you with Goodacre on saying John knows all three synoptics?
I think that's possible in its final version. John's gospel is complicated. Mm-hmm. I think it has very early material in it, and I think it has late material in it. So you have to be super careful about saying, John's gospel knows the synoptics. Yeah, possibly, but you appreciate what I'm saying.
Yeah, I totally get it. I think there's at least a couple layers, if not three or so, in how this gospel developed. And then I think he wrote a book on Thomas, how Thomas knows all four, the Gospel of Thomas, that this would put it late, whereas Elaine Pagels would try and put it really early, probably. I think Goodacre's saying Thomas is aware of the four Gospels. I don't know if you've read that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same sort of thing. This is not something that I'm a specialist in at all. And so I think that it's likely to be the case that Thomas is later than the four Gospels, but that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't have sayings in it which are really early, because it's the nature of the beast with a sayings gospel like that if you find another saying, you can just stuff it in. Because there's no narrative, it's really easy to add material you just happen to pick up here, there, and everywhere, and you might strike it lucky sometimes and find something really early, and you might be dealing with much later material in other cases. But I would listen to Mark Goodacre rather than me on that subject.
Right. I just interviewed Bart Ehrman recently. He's doing a course on the Gospels. He's calling it the Unknown Gospels. And I actually was trying to, in a sense, speak to my skeptic community, because I am a skeptic, but I love this stuff. I love learning about this stuff, and it's just a fascination of mine, kind of a nerd on it. But, there are those skeptics that are, in my opinion, like I used to be, too skeptical. And they say, like, if it's not in Paul, then it just isn't reliable because the Gospels have legendary material. And we just talked about how you were saying Thomas has possible earlier sayings. Depends, if you're picking apart, like, how do we know what's early and what's not? As far as if you were addressing a skeptic who's saying, well, Paul says this and it's very ambiguous. He doesn't talk about Jesus' mother. He doesn't talk about Pontius Pilate. He doesn't talk about who buried Jesus. Like, he doesn't go into any of this detail. What would you say to a skeptic who's coming over to the Gospels and they're like, nope, they're not reliable for historical gleaning. There's so much legend. You scholars can't even agree on what sayings really went back to Jesus. What would you say to them? I mean, I'm trying to encourage them to take the Gospels a little more seriously, at least, even if they do think something may not have gone back to the mouth of Jesus. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that you have to admit, first up, that we're dealing with stuff which is 2,000 years old. And so certainty is really not an option. But I think that if you and I were having this conversation in 2 or 3 years' time, I might be able to produce a better piece of evidence for showing that Luke is really close to this material. He seems to know stuff that he couldn't have known other than being very close. And so, I mean, I think that's really where I get a bit stuck, because you need hard evidence to show an early date, and I can't produce that now because it's the work is in process. But if you can show that Luke is the kind of gospel arm of Paul's ministry, so just say for a moment, if there's a really good argument, which I think there is, that Luke is a companion of Paul, then he's doing the storytelling part of that mission. Paul doesn't need to tell people the story of Jesus, because that's being provided for them by what Luke is doing. And can we talk about this a couple of years' time?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I was going to ask you, just something that came to mind was the idea that, like, if he's a companion of Paul, why does he need Mark's gospel? And like, so there's a lot of questions that come up when you start to do these things that make you want to know. You know what I mean?
I'd love to answer that question. So I think what happened, and you have to think in bold capitals, that what happened was that I think actually Mark and Luke are pretty contemporary. That Luke starts to write his gospel, he doesn't know Mark at all. And that would explain why he goes off track from what Mark says about the passion and the resurrection. Because if he had Mark from the beginning, that it's asking for quite a lot of trouble to go against the things that Mark is saying if Mark is already a respected gospel. So it makes more sense to me to think that he doesn't know Mark, but he's writing the story. He's gathering his material as he's traveling around the ancient world. Then he comes across Mark, either in person, because they're both mentioned together in the letter to Philemon, or someone says, look, you're working, like when have you seen this other podcast that this other guy's doing? People will say that to you all the time. If you're doing something, people say, do you know this other person that's doing the same thing as you? And so somebody says, well, here's Mark's gospel. And he looks at it and thinks, you know what? This has got some good stuff that I haven't got. And that's why he chunks it. He just takes blocks, picks them up and puts them in. If you take those blocks out, you still have a perfectly viable narrative. It tells a story that makes sense. But with those Mark and blocks inserted, it's fuller. It's got more information that people are going to be interested in. And actually, a striking thing about Luke's gospel is it's way long. It's much longer than a standard scroll length. And that could be because actually it was a more average length document in the first place, and later on it had other things added into it. I ought to add that was quite a popular view about 100 years ago. Now I think I'm the only person in the world who thinks that it's viable. So take that with a pinch of salt, but I would like to try and prove that, or make a case for it sometime later on.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate you giving us your time today and telling us your different ideas. I have friends with all sorts of different views, Goodacre. Dennis McDonald has a Q plus Papias hypothesis, but I don't think that you're probably in line with Goodacre on Q, right?
Not exactly.
Not exactly. Okay.
Not exactly. I am and I'm not. I think that, for the purposes of the broad brush, I am. I think he's right that Q is not necessarily because Matthew's using Luke directly. But I think it would be a mistake to eliminate the idea of sources that are shared by Matthew and Luke, because there's no reason. Matthew and Luke both use Mark. There's going to be other sources floating around. Why wouldn't they both use them as well? But if we're keeping it simple, which is always a good plan, I'm with Goodacre in that the Q is not necessary.
Okay. I was going to ask you about that statement about Papias. If you thought the two Matthews there, one of them might be that other material, but
it's perfectly possible. But we're into guesswork.
Exactly. Well, thank you. I can't tell you how much fun this has been. Everybody go check out my Patreon, help support us here, because you're watching this before everybody else for supporting. Go check out Dr. Garrow's blog, and you can subscribe. I believe you could subscribe, right? Get emails, notifications.
There's an RSS feed on it, but it's alangarrow.com. Has got videos and loads of stuff about the synoptic problem.
Let me go there here just to show everybody. Yeah, there you go. And of course, I'd love to get into the Didache with you at some point where we can see what you have to say. And when we cut out what looks to be that old stuff, there's stuff that's so different and just primitive, if I could use the term, that goes really early on. I think you and James Tabor agree on the Didache being extremely early. I haven't talked to anyone else specifically about it, but I think everybody should go check out your website. And then Amazon, if they're wanting to, go check out the Gospel of Matthew's Dependence on the Didache. I highly recommend.
I'm really sorry, Derek, but I can't recommend that for anybody who isn't a specialist because it will bore you silly. But I hope to produce a more attractive version of that argument sometime very soon. But if you are a specialist and you're interested in that kind of thing, by all means, check it out.
Yeah, I look forward to your upcoming publications. Can I throw one more at you just for the heck of it?
Of course.
Okay. Here is this pericope. Here we have. And this is, I'm just going to read it to you. If the order were Mark, Luke, then Matthew, that would mean that Luke splits up Mark's material between Luke 12 and Luke 21. Then Matthew reverts to Mark's structure while using Luke's language in this particular pericope.
Yeah, the way that I would explain that is that it does look like that Luke 12 is written without knowledge of Mark, according to my theory. But he comes across Mark 13, and he is making use of that in Luke 21. So that's why you've got two versions. And then Matthew, you can see he's got material from... Matthew is essentially using Mark there, isn't he? There's just a couple of little bits that in red that he's pulled across from Luke. That's my immediate response to that, but that's not a very well considered one, Derek, I admit.
No, this was on the spot, I think, too, and it wasn't like you had time to actually think that one's, look at the Greek, look at it carefully and things like that. But my friend Stephen Nelson, I want to say thanks for that image, because me and him have been working on this stuff for a while, and he loves the color code to show all of that fun stuff. And if you were to encourage somebody right now who is interested in these topics, what kind of words would you want to leave them with before we exit this episode?
You can solve the synoptic problem. All you need to do is to keep an open mind and to look at the data. And if you're reading a book, remember that the scholars so far have been looking at a very narrow range of options. Keep your mind open.
Thank you, Dr. Garrow. And ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. Join MythVision's Patreon today to access hundreds of videos that I have worked hard in high-quality content that are not in public domain. They're only on the Patreon. You will also have direct access to me, referring academics, questions, ideas, or just want a private chat. You have that access with me. Also, I'm trying to do more traveling to educate people from more academics and expand what kind of material I do produce on MythVision. This is a full-time gig, and you're helping the community by joining. I'm trying to put together more to educate people who have harmful cultic practices or ways in which they're harming society. We are educating them from MythVision on better understanding these ancient texts and mythologies and history in a way like not many shows do. So please, I could use your help, and you're going to get and benefit a lot by joining as a member.